So I think in the purpose of time, we can get going. Thank you all for joining this wonderful session that we've organized for today. Just maybe to introduce myself first, I'm Theodore and I'm Chief of Staff at VOX Solutions. Some of you know me, some of you have met me, either virtually or physically from clients tuning in. But to the rest, I say I'm happy to be talking to you for the first time. And I do thank you all for joining this lovely session. To provide some context to everybody to today's discussion, it will basically be focused around the opportunities that exist within the voice market while it's currently decreasing overall. And basically that contains multiple segments that operators can leverage in order to increase revenues. Joining me, I have Sam Barker, leading analyst or head of analytics and forecasting at Juniper Research. He's joining us as Juniper is launching an exclusive white paper on the matter, and he's here to share his thoughts from that side. Thank you, Sam, and I'm glad to have you here.
No problem.
Switching to the agenda, just to explain a bit the structure of the discussion that we're having today. So first, we will discuss about the emerging trends within the voice market overall and how its estimated overall evolution stands at this point in time. Secondly, I will let Sam run through the white paper that Juniper will be publishing. While the white paper will be out for purchase, it's not now. Everyone in our call will just get a copy and access to that just after our webinar. It's no news, but now we do have Sam along us. Himself and his team have been coordinating efforts to produce it. So we do have his insights and background and any questions that can be asked about anything white paper related. We do have Sam here because otherwise we would just be, reading it ourselves. So I'll then proceed into talking in detail about the opportunities that we still see in the voice market and specifically what can be done in order to capitalize on them. The time that we have today should be sufficient. And we do have a Q&A session planned for the end. So I will plan that for the last period of our call, but in case of anything, please start shooting questions in the chat, even through the webinar. And if we can, we will answer them on the spot. And if not, we will join all of them and answer to the end. So now passing it on to Sam, I'll let him talk about the content that himself and his team have been preparing and working it for the white paper's release. So on to you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Theodore. If we could move on to the next slide, I'll start talking about the voice market. So something that I think obviously many operators are looking into is the opportunities within the voice market. Obviously, operators' voice revenue or carriers' voice revenue is continuing to decline. It's a channel that is not as opportunity laden as it has been in the past, obviously with the move towards other areas, other data planes. Obviously, the areas that us and VOX have picked up here is obviously one. In general, mobile ARPU or average revenue per user is expected to continue to decline. This is mainly down to essentially the race to the bottom. The operators in the market continually looking to minimize churn to their competitors, as well as provide the best value. We've seen that more and more as 5G networks have launched. There's no premium on 5G like there was with 4G. So what we're seeing is more and more of operators, average revenue per user declining. But I think the headline there sums it up. The changing user habits, the way that we use mobile services is continuing to change. Again, 5G is much more focused on data, of course, than it is on messaging or voice. More and more of our mobile subscribers are moving towards using OTT or over-the-top applications for voice services, and this is leaving operators in a difficult position because voice is something that a service that is expected, but it's not easily monetizable, and we're moving towards data. So the idea that these OTT apps can innovate and implement new services a lot quicker without the limitations of telecommunication standards is something that's driving the market and driving mobile subscribers towards these OTT applications. Obviously, there's a few issues with things like regional fragmentation and not having the essentially having the app pre-installed on the phone, or making sure that the user definitely has that app, and then any call can be terminated. Again, and the other areas is things like mobile apps and other ways of what would be used for voice service before, moving towards mobile apps on smartphones. Things like commerce services, support services are becoming more and more automated and IP based, which means that voice channels are being used less and less regularly. And the same can be said for, as it mentions there, mobile browsing, where many users are looking to find information on the internet rather than through voice. But one thing we probably would like to highlight here is the graph on the left. This is the operators build voice revenue. First of all, up until 2022 is falling at 6.1% per annum, and afterwards we're anticipating it to fall on an average of 4.4% per annum. So we are expecting a small decline. And our white paper that we've done is highlights why we believe that this is going to happen. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll very quickly take you through what we think the voice market is going to look like and how to monetize it. So the white paper will go through things like how obviously the revenues are falling, but on this page here, we've identified three areas that we think are interesting for the voice market in terms of how operators can look to essentially bring life back to their voice channels. So the first one here is CCaaS or contact center as a service. What we're looking at here is the idea that it's essentially a software as a service platform where you will where enterprises can offer that to stakeholders like e-commerce vendors or anything that needs a support service over the phone. And operators are then going to work with the CCaaS vendors who are quite often already have that relationship with them, because they may work in as a messaging vendor or a CPaaS or communications platform as a service vendor, who have expanded into the CCaaS market. And that means that they have that relationship where they can look at wholesale traffic, work towards that, and the ability to have essentially a CCaaS center, which for definition's sake, we will the CCaaS center will take not just voice channels, but they also take messaging channels, email. Essentially, it's centralizing all the inbound contact from an enterprise's customers, all on one platform. And obviously, voice is going to play a big part of that, because that means it's the most immediate response. You are, in some instances, speaking directly to another human being, which many people, especially on the support side of the market, will find very, very valuable. From an operator's point of view, this is all about the wholesale traffic that can be sold to CCaaS vendors, and in terms of voice minutes in a regional aspect. So we're expecting more and more of enterprises to start adopting CCaaS solutions, but that'll be because they already have in line maybe a CPaaS solution or a UCaaS solution that is then CCaaS solution is then offered on top of that. Now, the most interesting one that we've identified is flash calling traffic. I'm sure many of you already have opinions on how this technology should develop and what should be done with it. But for those who don't know, flash calling traffic is going to have a massive impact on A2P SMS. In fact, I say it will do, it already is. The idea being that instead of sending a one-time password to a mobile subscriber, you make a quick phone call, which is then immediately disconnected, and the call log will then take the last 6 digits of that phone number and use that to authenticate whatever needs to be authenticated, the user or the service. So that means that from an operator's point of view, it can't be monetized yet, or it's more difficult to monetize, which means that from an enterprise's point of view, it's more about cost savings than anything else for authenticating a user, and that means operators are potentially going to be losing out on money if they're not able to identify this flash calling traffic. And lastly, we'll have a quick look at programmable voice. So as networks become more and more IP based, more virtualized, more reliant on software. The idea that voice is going to be a more malleable type of service for the enterprises is something that's going to be highly sought after over the coming years. Basically, the ability to use an API or other software to essentially manage the phone system. We expect that also this programmable voice to be integrated into CCaaS and CPaaS solutions in the future. The idea being that providing that value over a voice channel is the most important strategy, essentially, for many stakeholders in the market. I think the most important thing to note here out of all of these is there is a diminished faith in the voice ecosystem or the voice channel from mobile subscribers. You even see it in things like robocalling and unwanted calls, which is a real big problem in the US as well as other places. But the US is obviously a good example of how if voice channels are left unattended to, then mobile subscribers' trust in them is greatly reduced, and that means that stakeholders in the market can't monetize these new services over voice channels as much as they could do. So it's all about making sure that fostering that confidence in voice over OTT messaging or other channels, or keeping the voice channel confident in the voice channel as high as possible, so that these services can be implemented and can be monetized. If we just quickly move on to the next slide, we can start talking as well about how this confidence can be diminished. And obviously, one of the biggest issues is fraud. I mean, to use a phrase that I'm not particularly the keenest on, fraud goes where the money flows. Basically means as more and more services make money, you're always going to have malicious players or fraudulent players that are going to look to capitalize on that sort of the revenue that's being generated by those services. So as more and more money and more revenue is generated by voice over the coming years by operators who are willing to implement these new services, you're going to see more and more fraudsters essentially attempt to benefit from it and try and take money that could have been used. I think it's very, very similar to how you see things like grey route traffic in the SMS market. What you're seeing is even though the average price of an A2P SMS is small, realistically, when you're thinking of the aggregation of all of the traffic, moving it towards P2P or masquerading that A2P traffic as P2P traffic is obviously a huge cost saver. So the implementation of SMS firewalls will provide a return on investment, and the voice market is no different. The ability to implement a voice firewall into into networks is going to also provide a return on investment and be beneficial to operators. Obviously, moving back to things like robocalling, the ability for a voice firewall to detect and identify what is essentially fraudulent or at the very least unwanted is something that is going to be a key technology to implementing or increasing the trust in voice channels. And one of the sort of the key enabling technologies, or a few key enabling technologies, are VoLTE, voice over LTE, and voice over 5G. I do know VoLTE is 10 years old now. Voice over 5G is a couple of years old, but the idea that these technologies are becoming more and more IP based means that it's easier for operators to implement not only these voice firewalls, but changes to voice firewalls take on AI and machine learning to detect what's fraudulent and what's not. And obviously, in the long run, which is the goal, is to maximize the revenue from voice channels. And if you just quickly move on to the next page of the white paper, one of the solutions we've come up here is as we just mentioned, is these voice firewalls that we can, and it's all about when implementing them and managing them. It's all about the total cost of ownership of these voice firewalls. So the idea being that when you have a voice firewall that is operating on, through your network, the key is providing a return on investment. And obviously, the earlier the return on investment can be secured, the more successful the product's been. So companies like VOX have these voice firewalls that are able to basically detect traffic that's unwanted and increase the value, increase the cleanliness, so to speak, of voice channels. Operators working with third-party solutions in a similar way that the SMS firewalls are used today by operators is essentially going to be the main model in which the operators are going to tackle this the fraud in the voice market and maximize the monetization of voice services in the future. So sort of just to sort of sum up why that's important in the three things we've got that there is obviously fostering the increased confidence in voice channels. Without the ability to mobile subscribers having confidence in it, then no new service, no matter how innovative are going to work. And they need to provide a demonstrable return on investment to be successful. And that has to be done by minimizing the total cost of ownership of a firewall. If we just very, very, very briefly go on to the next page of the white paper, it discusses VOX's solutions and what can be done. But I think Theodore is in a much better position to take everybody through what VOX can do in this market and what they can and what solutions they have.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you for the wonderful explanation on the white paper and context on the voice market. I hope it's been insightful for everyone involved. So moving on, as Sam has said, while the overall market is decreasing for voice, there are still multiple opportunities to chase within the segment. So I'll go on next in the presentation and discuss which are the 4 pillars that have been identified on the next slide in detail. So, firstly, while we all know the voice industry can be considered mature, if not very mature, right? Much of it is still lost to fraud, unfortunately. And that means that operators' revenues globally are facing a decrease. Growth can actually be achieved, and in some cases, even double-digit growth from fraud elimination. And solving this is actually one of the backbones to revenue increase through other opportunities. So if the right technology is used to tackle fraud, it can become a prerequisite for also capitalizing on other opportunities that are seen in the voice market today. Now, as Sam has said, here specifically, I talk about 3 other growth pillars possible, which are ready to be capitalized. So the first one is A2P voice traffic in the form of flash calling. I will discuss that in detail in the next slides, but however, I'll just give a quick overview from now. So as most of you know, flash is the alternative to FA method, whereby authentication is done by OTT missed calls such as WhatsApp, Viber, Telegram, etc. As opposed to A2P SMS, it's basically a means for 2FA where the code is embedded within the A number and the application patches it automatically, meaning the user doesn't really have anything to do in terms of having the 2FA process complete, right? So the authentication happens in the background. On this end, we see flash calling it can be either a threat or a capitalizer on an opportunity, rightfully. I'll go into that in more detail later. However, for now, I'll just shortly cover the reason behind the claim of what I just said. So in terms of having it as a threat, currently, most operators, from what we've seen, do not have the technology to identify and build flash accordingly. Hence, at this point, they're just seen as missed calls for which termination cost is 0. On the other hand, the provider that is charging OTTs for 2FA is actually the only player that is benefiting from this at this point in time, and the operators are losing on it, as Sam said. And for now, it's used as a, let's say, cost-cutting alternative. However, rightfully, an official billing channel can be put in place for flash. Alternatively, with the right technology, A2P voice can be turned into a channel, charge the according rate, and that is basically the operator's discretion, right, in terms of controlling pricing. This is on A2P voice. Second, we see the rise and additional segments. So for example, as Sam said, CCaaS or contact center as a service, or leveraging programmable voice. But as he and his team mentioned, for these cases, it is paramount that the backbone in the technology stack of the operator has the capability to identify such traffic. So to wrap up, all these are 4 factors that are drivers for voice revenue growth in the future. However, here there must be a collaboration, and this happens if the right technology is implemented. Moving on, I will tackle and go a bit more detail into the discussion on fraud, because we've mentioned it to be as a backbone. Sam's team also see it as, I'll call it prerequisite, right? Not only in terms of having the technology to identify different types of voice traffic, but also in terms of trust, if we're talking about A2P segments, which are business related. So going here and turning our eyes to fraud, I'm showing you a slide where basically we have a study done by the CFCA. So specifically, it tackles fraud and shows that fraud is increasing every year, sometimes even in double-digit growth year on year, right? So this is happening when the revenue loss from fraud is increasing double-digit per year, all while voice revenues globally are decreasing. So actually, if we do isolate fraud, right, we could even say that the voice market is only slowly declining or rather stagnating. However, we're seeing fraud is taking an increased share of the pie, right? Representing one of the factors for the markets to decrease in that sense. So here specifically, we're looking at 3 types of fraud only: international revenue share fraud, arbitrage, and interconnect bypass. And we can see that the cumulated loss of only these 3 types of fraud, while multiple others exist, is of 13 billion per annum. And this was, at least this was the figure for 2021. So if we do add up all the other types of fraud, we do see that the share is significant. And this all happens with the voice market still being under pressure, right? And while the magnitude is important in terms of the revenue loss associated to fraud, the growth of fraud loss is even more staggering. So if we're looking at international revenue share fraud, the increase is of 15% per annum from 2019 to 2021 of each year. So accumulated, that really means around 35% increase in IRSF in only 2 years, right? And also the CFCA study shows that fraud has increased by 39% in the same time frame in 2 years, right? All while voice revenues are decreasing. So I think it's important to, and we have actually turned our eye and asked, why is that the case in such a mature market? And what we have seen and identified is a combination of various different factors that lead to it. There is no one single explanation, but a multitude of variables that lead to it. So first, the voice market is still huge and will continue to be, right? So fraudsters are motivated to becoming even more, I'll say, creative on this side to get a share of the pie. And as we can see from the study done by the CFCA, that share of the pie is increasing. Sam said fraud goes where the money flows, and that's correct. And if we're talking about the market and voice being huge, this is also linked to the fact that the cost in entering in such practices, right, and for technology, the price point for fraudsters actually going into it, it can be decreasing because the access to technology globally and the cost of technology globally is decreasing. So this would be the first thing. And it's basically just linked to financial incentive. Second, this happens because voice is a very mature market, right? And sometimes legacy systems can be in place or firewalls that are updated to the innovation, let's say, that fraudsters make. So fraud is a very dynamic space from what we've seen. And many times we do see different types of fraud emerging, certain types of fraud emerging that were, for example, minimal in levels in the past period. So really here, it's all about keeping up with the market, analyzing traffic heavily, staying up to date with all that fraudsters are making, and ensuring that doesn't happen, right? So I will talk in more in detail on technology on the next slide, but for now I'll just say that from what we've seen, a high share of the operators do not have the, let's say, backbone technology as up to date and to be able to tackle any and all increasing types of fraud, right? So going on to the next slide, I will actually like to show and discuss with you another part of the same CFCA study, which talks specifically about the adoption of such technologies within today's operator landscape. So specifically in this sample, the study is focused on seeing the penetration of signal record monitoring, or as some of you know it, SRM, within today's world. In this context, this is the basis of fighting voice fraud, right, has been and still is CDR analysis. And vast majority of operators have this in place. The trick is that CDR analysis is done by looking at call detail records, which are generated after the call has been terminated, right? So this makes it a reactive approach, as one can spot fraud after that has happened. On the other hand, signal record monitoring is a mechanism that examines calls from the beginning, making it possible to mitigate fraud in real time. And this is basically where the trick happens. And if we turn our eyes to the graph on the left side, this study shows that only a bit over a third of operators are actually using SRM and are able to identify fraud fully in real time. There is another third that only uses CDRs, and then there's a bit less than a third that are saying that they're not certain, but as the sample goes, and from what we've seen, the operators that are not certain of using our SRM actually don't use it. So here we can draw the conclusion that almost a third of operators out there can spot fraud in real time, and this more or less shuts an eye to, or opens an eye to, the possible technologies that are out there. So this is the kind of shift from what we've seen that must be done to combat fraud in today's landscape, alongside using technology that doesn't only pack such mechanisms, but one that packs multiple modules in a powerful solution or complete solution, right? That does not only combat fraud, but also helps MNOs capitalize on other growth opportunities, which we've mentioned at the beginning, also both myself and Sam. So to close this section on trends and fraud, I will turn our eyes a bit on flash calling or A2P voice on the next slide. So to this end, Juniper has done another interesting study. So while Sam is talking to us today about this white paper, his team at Juniper Research and himself have been also involved in another study basically on the emergence of flash calling. And it was the first one basically to come out at the time on the topic. So it really opened the eyes of many players on why flash is a significant trend that must be taken into consideration and to be acted upon. So specifically, as said, flash calling is a means to do two-factor authentication via missed calls of OTTs, and there are many factors for which flash calling will actually be the traffic segment that will see the highest growth in terms of volumes within the next years out of all segments. So first, it's cheaper than A2P SMS, right? And now it's not even billed at all, as Sam has rightfully said so. The cost for that and the revenue for the operator in most cases is zero. This is the first consideration. Second, it's more user-friendly as A2P SMS because, as I've mentioned, authentication happens in the background and users basically, they just have to consent to the terms and conditions of any OTT app that is utilizing flash calls. And then by reading the call logs, the authentication is done without copy-pasting any code or whatnot, but I'll not get into in detail of that. So I assume most of you out here are familiar with that. If not, please reach out to me or write it in the questions and I'll be able to go on that more in detail in the Q&A at the end. The third reason for which flash is seen as something to act upon is, given the code is embedded within the A number, flash calling as opposed to A2P SMS has no content, right? So that means it can't be manipulated. While it has some limitations, right, because there's no content, the fact that it can't be manipulated is actually something that can make it safer and makes it very interesting for certain verticals, right? So for all these reasons combined and others, but these are the main ones, Juniper Research analysts and Sam's teams estimated that there are currently around 5 billion flash calls in volume in terms of in 2022. However, that penetration obviously depends in terms of geographies, countries, but globally that number will increase by more than 25 times within 4 years and reach close to 130 billion calls in 2026. And that's staggering growth, right? Because if you look at it effectively in terms of volume, that means that flash calling volume is more than doubling every year, right? So if we're looking at the growth of A2P SMS, and some studies around the world show that the volume of A2P SMS is growing in the single digit, right? So it can be 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%. It ultimately really depends also on the region. The growth of flash is bound to be consistently higher than that. And this is in terms of volume. If we're looking in terms of potential market size, because flash is currently not really built, or in terms of revenue for the operator, it doesn't really exist. The growth and the market size on the opportunity of that for operators is consistently way higher in 2026 than double growth per year, right? If the price variable is taken into account. But I think most importantly here is not really to go in detail on the evolution of flash, but rather to talk about ways that can be basically fought against and then leveraged or capitalized. So ultimately, at this point in time, I think 3 strategies exist, and I'll go into detail onto each and every one of them. So obviously, option 1 is do nothing about it, but that's not really an option. But it is something that can be brought into discussion. But as termination cost is 0 for flash call at this point in time, without the right technology, it will effectively, flash just means it capitalizes, it cannibalizes A2P SMS revenues, right? Without no gain. So A2P SMS volumes are just lost as a lot of OTP traffic or 2FA traffic shifts towards flash. And from what we've seen, there are reactive measures that are trying to be put in place, like blacklists and operators around the world, but they don't work at large, meaning that to capitalize on flash, you really need to identify it in real time. And this is where it happens, and this is where the shift has to be, as opposed to using blacklists. You have to be able to block it and spot it in real time, wherever it might be coming from, right? So we do estimate in simulations that we've done that operators or players that don't really do anything to address flash in the long term, they will have A2P SMS revenues or volumes actually cannibalized by about 25% in the coming years if nothing is done in terms of flash, while the penetration of flash is increasing. So this is regarding the first option that exists. The second one is to partner up, have the right technology in place to identify flash and then block flash. This basically ensures that A2P SMS is not cannibalized, right? As flash can go through the network. But it also does not mean that flash is capitalized fully. So based on what we've seen here in the simulations that we've done, we do see that operators going on this approach will have growth in A2P SMS revenues within the next years of around 20 to 25%. Obviously, that depends on the geographies. But the core of that is that blocking flash allows operators to fully leverage, right, on the organic growth and not lose any of the potential A2P SMS volume growth that happens naturally, lost to flash, and also get back part of the volumes that have already been lost to flash in some geographies. And obviously here, that penetration differs by country. This is the second strategy, blocking flash. The third one is monetizing it, right? And this is the one that actually yields the highest revenue and profits. So here we use technology to identify it and then turn flash into a fully monetizable end-to-end channel. So why is that the case? One can argue that turning flash or A2P voice into a fully monetizable channel with the price of flash being below that of A2P SMS, it will naturally trigger a revenue decline. But that may not be the case due to a few factors. So first, as said, Flash has no content, makes it safer for some verticals. Such verticals include fintechs or other financial providers, right, that are willing to pay a premium in terms of safety. So it can be capitalized as a certain product that can have a premium in order to solve the issues that some industries are facing or for which they're not really using some of them A2P and SMS from any concerns regarding content manipulation. The second is that when monetizing Flash, ultimately you do control Flash, right? So you do control the price of the OTT service effectively that is being used as a 2FA method. And that basically brings control to the equation. But that also means that the price of Flash can be at any level that is desired. So it can be brought marginally below A2P SMS. It can be priced as A2P SMS, or if it's priced below A2P SMS, as the rate or as you increase A2P SMS, right, you also increase the price of Flash accordingly. And then you have always like a relationship where one increases, the other follows, one increases, the other follows. And this also provides a backbone, right, to any A2P SMS rate increase in the future. Because now if one increases or triples, let's say his A2P SMS rate, yes, you can control gray routes and other bypass in the network, but some traffic will definitely be lost and shifting towards Flash. So for that reasons, studies and simulations shows that on average, any operator who's willing to monetize it will have an additional upside in revenue and traffic of around 10% in A2P volumes and revenue compared to anyone who's blocking it. So at the end, it is a decision for all of you and for each operator out there to take, but it's a way to not stop the process from the beginning, but actually a way for any operator to control the way in which this OTT-related specific service is priced. And I think that's an interesting equation, because if we take a step back into why Flash calling has emerged, a lot of it has a price-related component, right? So I'm not going to go into the full history of it, but there's been multiple points in time in which the real rate of A2P SMS or SMS has increased for businesses. So we had national, international differentiation that came with rates. We've had A2P versus P2P split that came with different rates. And even now, operators around the world are even further differentiating their A2P pricing within SMS. So we've seen operators that are splitting now transactional and promotional traffic, right? And basically creating OTP related A2P SMS as a premium service, right, while keeping promotion at a lower rate. So that's a further differentiation. And there are also other operators globally that they do OTT specific pricing, right? So ultimately, the emergence of Flash or any other authentication method, apart from what it has to do in terms of use case, also happens to, for some enterprises, tackle the cost of 2FA via A2P SMS. To build up on that, even if there's been differentiation, there's also a fight that all of us do in terms of gray routes, right? So even if, let's say, the rate is X, OTTs might be paying less than that because sometimes bypass routes are used by fraudsters. So effectively, the price increase of SMS over the past years has actually been more significant if you look at it from the real cost and the fight on the usage of gray routes. So this is in terms of market context, and I hope that it's been holistic and complete as an approach. I'm looking forward to discussing it more at the end of the presentation. But for now, I'll lastly go on to this last section that we have and basically talk about the technology that we have at VOX that can tackle the issues that we've mentioned above. So going on, as I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but as most of you know, our technology has been implemented at tens of operators, and VOX has been the first player to develop a solution to identify and to build Flash calls. Still, it's the only one, as we know, in the market for Flash calling that is currently under client implementation and also monetizing Flash calls. I'll not make a lot of comments here, but I'll go on the next slide. and which I'll cover the modules of our solution. This is also the last slide that I have in the presentation. But here I want to spend a bit more time and go in detail on what's happening and how that is solved specifically. So our solution at VOX, which is called VOX 360, is quite complex, and it's backed through 6 main different services that we provide in a managed services way. So that ultimately means that we don't just give the technology, but we also help you operate the technology. We're there in terms of assisting you to make the most out of it in terms of analytics, in terms of blocking capabilities, and also you have our 24/7 support. So, but to go a bit back on what the core of our solution is, it's based on a few modules. So first, we do have we're basing it on our proprietary analytics engine and AI algorithms. And when we combine that with our database, which is also proprietary, and it has 1 billion data points that are collected over time in different instances, we're able to spot fraud. We're able to identify flash calls and any other type of voice traffic by certain logics and parameters. And that's coupled with our proprietary voice firewall, which helps stop bypass and fraud in real time, right? Last, our analytics comes with customizable reports. Whatever you want, there's a GUI out there, a dedicated network audit team to ensure that our systems deliver the optimal performance, and then 24/7 monitoring, of course. On that part, as we provide the managed service, we also provide like insights to our clients to what we see around the world, conferences, participations to forums, discussions with any other players, or clients, obviously in a confidential way. So we're all connected in terms of trends, because we've seen it both in the voice and in the SMS market. There are regions in which a specific type of fraud in SMS is currently increasing, and that doesn't happen in other countries. However, once that is spotted, it just makes sense that everyone prepares for it around the world, right? Assuming that's easy. So we're actually able to do that. And here we do have our teams collaborating and talking and advising our clients in terms of anything that has to be done in a preventive way rather than reactive, when volumes, for example, are lost, or when certain, let's say, phenomenon trigger unpleasant customer experience, which obviously none of us want. So we do work on a preventive grounds, and we do work with you alongside always in order to ensure that we're not just a technology provider, but also a partner in terms of your A2P business, P2P business, or the technology that you're collaborating with us in scope. So I'm going to just quickly go in terms of impact. So, I mean, the impact of our partnerships go in, it really depends on the region, but from what we've seen in past years, wherever our solution's been implemented, in terms of eliminating bypass, identifying flash, helping you with pricing strategy in terms of rates, usually what we've seen is that our clients have an A2P revenue increase or growth, and probably doubling it in only 1 year. But it ultimately depends on geographic locations and variety of factors. But this is sort of the impact that you can expect. Looking on the clock mark, so I think there's close to 15 minutes left. I did struggle to get all the content in terms of the time to let everyone have a say in the Q&A, since we're all here and it's a big group, and I'm happy for all of us to share insights and also detail anything that's been said in the presentation, either in the white paper, since we do have Sam, and he does know the methodology and he does know the specifics. And as I said, when we read it at home, all of us, he's not going to be there. But also in terms of solution and any other market-specific trends or the geography-specific trends that you might want to ask. So I do hope that the session has been, let's say, fruitful or complete for everyone, and good in terms of insights. But now I'll first thank Sam. I will also thank you for listening to me for such a long time. And I'll open the floor to questions in case there are any that you would like us to share or answer. Below with me, I have also multiple colleagues from our teams globally. They have regional views as well. So I am welcoming everyone from VOX in terms of if there are any region-specific questions, in order to be able to address anything in the most complete way. So thank you all, and I do look forward to the questions.
Hi, it's Fraser King here from Vodafone. So thanks for the presentation. I got two questions. One was around your the sort of forecast of flash calls. 128 billion flash calls by 2026. I mean, I don't know where that stat comes from, right? I mean, I think there's about 23 billion SMSs sent today, so that does seem quite high. Can you explain where you see this growth coming from, right? Because it's kind of almost a market that's 5x the size of the SMS market today. So that does seem quite high for what is ultimately just the authentication component.
Absolutely, Fraser. So would you like to go over the next one as well, or us to tackle the first one and get to the second question?
Yeah, I guess the next one, and this doesn't come up so much, but I mean the Mobile Ecosystem Forum have just produced a white paper on flash calling, right, which I believe VOX kind of contributed to, and I think there's certainly they certainly raise the kind of the concept that flash calling as it is today is probably quite easily considered abuse of the mobile network, right? You've got people coming in on what are P2P links, bypassing, enterprise authentication routes, SMS number verify some of these services. These calls are not being terminated, they're not being billed. So, do you not sort of think that there will be brands out there that certainly recognize that abusing a mobile network is probably not the right strategy? If the mobile operators were to stand up and say, hey, flash calling is abuse of the mobile network, I sense there are brands out there that would say it's not worth the effort, if you like, right? I understand that the opportunity to legitimize it, and I think there's a lot of debate around that. But I think certainly, and I'm not the voice guy, by the way, right? But from the outside, I certainly look at this and go, you know what? Any brand who's actually doing this for their customers is clearly abusing certainly the spirit of interconnect. Whether or not it actually breaches any kind of rules or regulations, I think that's more of a legal question. But yeah, that's I think something that many brands who are considering flash calling must be hyper aware of, right?
Yeah, agreed. So I think if it's fine, if I'll go to answering the second question, and then in the first one we have Sam here. So he knows more knowledge on that forecast. But I'll answer the second question just because it is linked to the first one, I believe, and the way that it is. I'll just shed some light on it quickly. So it is true. I mean, at this point in time, asset termination cost is zero. No one is billed, right? Apart from the enterprise that wants to authenticate its players. And what you see is a lot of players in the middle that basically take flash, and the operators get nothing. So yes, it is abusive. And in terms of legality, you're correct. The frameworks in different countries are different. So that's why it can only be done and monetized fully if you turn that into an official channel that you control, right? And then you have agreements with everyone in place, with all aggregators out there, for example, that any flash call comes for a dedicated trunk, it can be identified, it can be built, and then you turn it into a service. But that is done obviously with the agreement, full cooperation of the MNOs and other players out there. But you are correct in that sense. So and now it's abuse of the market in a way. And that's why everyone or most people out there usually go for blocking flash at this point in time. And when that base will increase, it will probably, because by blocking it, you have to identify it, right? And there will be a point in time where different players will divert into monetizing it, different players will divert into blocking it. But it ultimately speaks also to going back to the estimate, right? Because that estimate and increase in flash penetration is ultimately linked to the adoption of players that are generating high volumes of 2FA traffic, right? So it is speaking about the legitimacy of it. And if we know and look actually to the high traffic generators for 2FA traffic or OTP traffic, specifically, I think, most networks, in 70 to 90% of all international A2P SMS traffic is generated by the top 10, top OTTs, right? And 80% out of that is actually done by Meta platforms, Google, TikTok, Microsoft, etc., etc. I think everyone here understands that. So the question actually is, and to derive a point from what you've said, is Flash limited in growth really to the current legitimacy, right, that it brings? Because these OTTs have to be on board in high traffic generators in understanding that currently these are not built, right? And as a concept, you would obviously say that yes, should OTTs and global players should really turn an eye to that and really care about the end-to-end perspective, right? But the only thing that's happened is, while that stands claim correctly, if you do look from what we've seen around the globe, we've seen Flash penetration increasing to a high percent. So I think I know that we've had a discussion with someone from Pakistan who were saying that the high share of their A2P SMS traffic basically disappeared because TikTok implemented 2FA for Flash as a main 2FA method, right? And we are seeing increasing penetrations everywhere, in both in the clients we advise and otherwise in discussions with players and other operators. So while it is true, and the legitimacy of Flash for now, because there is no end-to-end perspective on it and way to build it is illicit, right, or borderline, and it can certainly be considered abusive. The problem really stands that the high traffic generators at this point in time, some of them care, but some of them don't. So this is what happens. Now, if we turn an eye specifically to, the larger brands out there, the largest ones out there like Meta, for example, right, or Google, or the ones that are really top 5, let's say, in terms of generating traffic. In general, you would say that these ones are the last ones to adopt Flash, right? Because it's a new technology and they'll let everyone else pilot it and then try it, right? But it really depends, because we've seen, for TikTok is no small player, right? It's huge in terms of traffic generated, especially in some markets. So if they can switch to Flash automatically, it also means, or it implies that at a certain point in time, a player like Meta that also has WhatsApp as a channel to, kind of like internally test and full have control over it since they're part of the same group, at some point can be deployed, right? So this is my perspective.